Hi there, and welcome to the Nintex Next Perspective series. Today, we're going to talk about the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is an annual survey that measures the trust and credibility across various institutions, sectors, and geographies across the world. The survey captures the opinions of more than 32,000 people in 28 countries each and every year, making it one of the largest and most comprehensive studies of its kind. It's something I personally look forward to reading every year. And in a world that seems more polarized than ever, business leaders are being asked to step up and understand how to navigate some of the unique challenges that we all face around trust, ethics, and the role of technology to help bridge the divide. My name is Ben Tamblyn, and I'm the VP of Communications and Brand at Nintex. And today I'm here with Troy McCombs, who oversees Edelman's US enterprise technology portfolio. And today he's going to provide us with a glimpse into some of the findings of this year's survey. And I also have a ton of questions for Troy, which we'll dive into in just a minute. But Troy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ben. I very much appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. So why don't we start by having you share some slides and thoughts about this year's Trust Barometer?
Okay, that sounds great. Again, Ben, thank you so much. So let me just, Ben, you touched on this, but I wanted to just, reiterate that we do this every year. The survey this year was fielded in the month of November. So we do 28 countries with 32,000 respondents, and it's significant, statistically significant, how many respondents we have from each country. We've been doing this for 23 years, and this has become the gold standard for measuring trust. We release the results every year at Davos, and then we present to clients, but also universities and teaching institutions use this data. But as I say, it's the gold standard, and we're approaching 25 years of having done this. What's interesting about this is we can view this as a movie versus a snapshot. So this year's findings are very sobering, and so I'll jump right into kind of what they are. So we measure trust in 4 institutions: business, non-government agencies, government, and media. The headline this year is the most trusted institution is business. And so, on the one hand, for us that, work in technology companies, that's a good thing, right? But wanted to highlight how some of the distrust in some of the other institutions, specifically government, is affecting our countries. So, if we talk about trust, businesses being most trusted, let's talk about individuals. And one of the things that's most interesting to me in this year's findings is trust is local. And what do I mean by that? Meaning, generally speaking, there's a broad distrust, and this is globally, of government leaders, of journalists, of CEOs. And yet, what's interesting is who do you trust? People trust citizens of my country. People trust more people in my community. They trust more my neighbors. And interestingly, on the one hand, as a category, they don't trust CEOs, but they do trust my CEOs. Further is coworkers are among the most trusted where people get information. So we dug a bit deeper and say, well, when we look at kind of how much trust and distrust is out here, one of the things that's very sobering to me personally is that globally speaking, that governments are seen as a source of more false or misleading information than they are of being a source of trustworthy information. And normally, media is seen as the guardians of truth. You can see that they're down about with government. And so there's this cycle of distrust, and there's this huge, worry about misleading information out there. So what I want to do for the next few slides is unpack why that's not good for us as any society or for business. So this is very sobering to me. We ask people, will my family be better off in 5 years than they are, in 5 years than they are today? And you can see that that has been steadily declining. And this year it's dropped by 10 points from, say, 2000 and 2019. So one of the other things I would call out is it's interestingly in the developed countries, those in the black are less optimistic, and those in the developing countries are more optimistic. But as a group, as you measure this as a whole, economic optimism is collapsing. So if you want to add, if you say there's a, let's add that to the fire of fears going on from our research, people have deep worries about their personal well-being in terms of, being able to provide for their family. So 9 out of 10 people we surveyed were worried about job loss. They're worried about inflation. But if you go further, and this is very sobering this year, is that people they have existential fears. They're worried about climate change. They're worried about nuclear war with what's going on in Ukraine. People are worried about food shortages. They're worried about energy shortages. So there's a lot of worry. There's a lot of misinformation that's out in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about what all this means. What our findings this year find is there's so much distrust in the world that there's ever greater polarization. People are going into their corners. So we asked this question. We said and again, this you can see how many countries here at the we measure. So we asked the question: is my country or is your country more divided today than in the past? More than half said yes. It's interesting to me is in some of the countries where there might be a one party, like Saudi Arabia or Singapore or Indonesia, they don't agree with this statement. But in places where there's democracy, where there's freedom of speech, they say, yes, my country is more divided in the past. For me, this is perhaps the most sobering of all of the slides that I will talk with you about. So the impact of polarization, mistrust, is, as I mentioned earlier, people are going to the corners. And so in this case, we asked the question, if a person strongly disagreed with me or my point of view, I would help them if in a time of need. Only 3 out of 10 said that they would be willing to help them. Further, we asked them if they would be willing to live in the same neighborhood if they disagreed strongly with my point of view. Only 2 out of 10 said yes. And only 2 out of 10 said they'd be willing to have them as a co-worker. Now, this is Troy's personal opinion. That's appalling. What we're finding is we're going to our corners and there's less civil discussion in the public square. So I want to talk a little bit about what the implications for that are for business and what the implications for all of that is for trust in technology. So there's the good news and bad news here. The headline is we measure trust in all of these industry sectors. The good news is technology remains the most trusted sector above, say, manufacturing or telecommunications or energy. The gold standard is tech. Now, the subhead is less optimistic.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing, if you look over the past 7 years, technology as a sector has been steadily declining. In 2016, 19 out of 21 countries said, yep, that's the most trusted sector. Today, that's only 11 out of 21 countries. So you can see we've rebounded a little bit, but trust in tech is on the steady decline. And so you say, well, okay, but what does that mean for it declining in, for emerging innovations? Specifically, we ask about some of the technology subsectors like AI or, AR. And so you can see that that has declined steadily. And what was interesting to me is I actually can't wait until next year's research comes out because this was fielded before ChatGPT. So I think we'll see some probably surprising numbers next year around this. If you go further, and why this matters if trust is low, what that does is that impacts adoption of new technologies, specifically in developed markets. So we ask the question, well, would you be willing to adopt a new technology? In the developed markets, only 1 out of 10 said yes. In the developing markets, 1 out of 3 said they'd be willing to do this. So this polarization, this mistrust, people don't know where they can go for information. The impact of this is people, are being slower to adopt new technologies. So, I presented kind of the sobering findings, but also that tech can lead. I want to just talk about what I call our what shall we do moments. So I just wanted to suggest really 4 things that our research suggests. Number 1, business of the 4 institutions is most highly regarded. And so as the most trusted institution, it should be leveraging its competitive advantage to deliver on issues like, sorry, Ben, did you have a question?
No, keep going, Troy. This is great. Thank you.
Yep. So business is expected to act as the most trusted institution. It should be used to deliver solutions to things like climate change, DE&I, and skill training. So the good news is business has permission to lead. The second thing is collaborate with government. You might say, well, what do you mean I got to collaborate with government? We don't mean literally you've got to form an initiative, but let's work on issues together. Whether it's climate change or other issues, it's chipping away and addressing some of the most pressing issues before us. There's an expectation that we should be building consensus, and we should be coming at it from different positions to solve the same issue. The other thing that's interesting is being able to restore economic optimism. So what does that mean? It means companies investing in fair compensation. It also means investing in training and being involved in local communities, helping address that mass class divide that exists out there. And then I will say, and Ben, you and I have talked about this. This is one that I'm personally passionate about. The 4th one is advocating for the truth. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is businesses should be a source of reliable information. They should be promoting civil discourse. I talked a little bit about this earlier, that there needs to be room in the public square for civil discussions. Otherwise, we go further and further in our corners. And lastly, we need to be holding false information sources accountable. So I feel pretty strongly about that, but I will stop. I'll get off my soapbox, Ben, and turn it back to you. And
that's great, Troy. That's great. Yeah, and it's, folks, we've had just 20 minutes to really just scratch the surface of some of the incredible findings that Edelman and Troy and the rest of the team have uncovered. Troy, you used the term sobering a few times throughout the presentation. And, a lot of what you've shared with us, is indeed incredibly reflective and doesn't necessarily paint the most beautiful picture of the world of the future. But there's got to be something that we can be optimistic about. Is there 2 or 3 things that you would kind of put your finger on that sort of says, here is what we have to be optimistic about as we look to the future?
Yes, I mean, that's a very fair question. I touched on this. Yeah, the findings. Let me just say, I've given this presentation and including to some universities, and this notion of be kind in the workplace. You don't know where you'll be in 10, 15 years. And so one of the things the research finds, highlights is the need for civil discussion and to be kind. So that's the first thing I'm passionate about that. And then the second thing is there's an opportunity for business to lead, right? And so being involved in the community, addressing these things and communicating it. I'm not suggesting self-congratulatory, but in an authentic and sincere way. We have a license to lead. Yeah. That's exciting. And so I do think that there's opportunities there. And I also think that being a source of information, good, reliable information, we have that opportunity as well. So I just think, businesses is expected to lead, but within that, technology is the most trusted sector. Right. If not us, who?
Right. No, that's great. I think that's great guidance. The other big thing that kind of came out for me was this growing trust gap between, I guess, what we would describe as the informed public and the mass population.
That's right.
And you sort of touched a little bit on why you think that gap exists. I would love to see you expand on that a little bit. But I think maybe more importantly, I'd love to understand, what role do you think technology organizations in particular play in terms of being able to bridge that gap?
Yeah. This is a complicated issue. So I don't know that I can solve on this, but I can give you my thoughts. I mean, number one, we talked about this, and I'm seeing this in my own family, right? I have people that are on the left side, people that are on the right side, and never shall they meet, right? And so I guess the thing that's, frankly, in my own family, I see siblings, right? They're on different ends of this. And what's worrisome to me is that people are only going to one or two sources of information. And so what there needs to be, our research, and this was from last year's trust findings, is when you talked about, Ben, an informed public, is when people go to four to six sources of information and are reading it regularly, they come towards the center in terms of being able to have the discussion. So my number one recommendation is don't just read one source of information. Read multiple sources of information. You can be informed. It's interesting. I read all kinds of information, but it helps me to come to the center. So the number one thing I would say, Ben, is read multiple sources of data information to give an informed point of view. Don't just stay in the echo chamber speaking to people that think that I do. It's good to have people that believe differently. So anyway, that's my number one recommendation. That, as I say, that there needs to, if there's going to be public discussion, people need to have an informed point of view and need to have multiple sources of information.
And beyond providing the platforms to disseminate this greatest source of information, what else do you think technology companies should be responsible for being able to support?
So I think there's an opportunity for me. I'm passionate about this as well. That I think that I've seen some amazing work with technology companies doing some primary research and then sharing that out and doing that through some social channels. But I think there's opportunities for businesses to be addressing that. I also think we talked a little bit about this, that being involved in your local communities. I've seen some really heartwarming stories of companies being involved. I think so. Two things. I'm just on the fly here. Number one is taking advantage of primary research opportunities to address some of these issues, and then sharing that out as broadly as you can. The second thing, as I think, is not only talk the talk, walk the walk.
Yeah, makes sense. That's great. So Troy, you touched on the fact that the Edelman Trust Barometer was published right before we started to see this explosion of generative AI and specifically ChatGPT. So I'm curious, what role and responsibility do you think technology companies and digital platforms like ChatGPT play in terms of shaping the public's trust?
So we're seeing, just as we're all witnessing, this tremendous hype. But if you were to kind of chart this, it feels a little bit like we've reached the Gartner hype cycle. We've reached the peak. And so, there was an article earlier this week about the father of ChatGPT stepping away from Google, being concerned about the dark players being able to use this. So there's concern about that. There's concern about people worried about their jobs. Some research we had done a few years ago on this topic. So on the one hand, it feels very hypey. On the other hand, it feels like we'll come back down, but on the backside, we will find meaningful ways to help us AI to do our jobs. And so I think the future, I actually believe that our best days are ahead of us. And I think this technology will become adopted, not in the hypey way that we're seeing, but it'll help us all of us do our jobs better. That's my personal opinion. And technology's job is to embrace that and to help our people live up to their best possibilities.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you talked a little bit before part of some of the outcomes of the trust barometer, that there's a responsibility for business, but there's also an opportunity to partner with governments as well.
Fully.
And I think increasingly, businesses have, especially in technology, have an incredible opportunity to begin to set some guiding principles around how they're going to think through things like product design and development in a way that is done in a trusted, fair, ethical, and equitable way. And ultimately, a lot of that early thinking that's going to happen from business leaders is ultimately going to hopefully be translated into legislation that ultimately governments can apply. I think that's the model that you're hoping for. Is that accurate?
That's a very fair representation of one of the hoped outcomes.
Yeah.
I think that's a very fair characterization.
Great. So let's talk a little bit more about the role of business and how business leaders are being asked to take on more. I think increasingly employees are actually demanding that companies take action on a really wide variety of sort of social and environmental issues. And you touched on a couple of them in your report out. How can organizations and leaders in particular strike the right balance between being a really good corporate citizen,
yep,
and also meeting the needs of boards and shareholders and so forth?
So that's an excellent question. One of the things that we're seeing is just what you said, specifically people entering the workforce. Some of the issues we've talked about, that's a reason for them to join a company or not. That's a thing. And so that's a new stakeholder that in the past, when I graduated from college, like, hey, you just, jump in your seat and just do what I tell you to do. So I think that So I think that you're absolutely right about this. But I think that the number one thing that I would say for business is the days of command and control are over. Being transparent about what you're doing, because let's be honest, businesses in business to make money and to return investment from shareholders, right? But at the same time, they now have this responsibility to work with other stakeholders, and I think that's the piece of this that's tricky. But the number one recommendation that I would say is being transparent, and it's not a democracy, if you will. It's a business, but at the same time, being transparent and communicating what your vision is and having people buy into this, so people know when they join the company, this is where we're going, and I get it. That's different from when I started my career.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting to watch that transition, because a little bit like you, Troy, I kind of grew up in a world where I started my career with a cubicle and a set of instructions. And I think increasingly what leaders are now asking people to do is they're asking people to define the best way to work themselves and define what's important to them as an individual, but also as a community of people as well. And that's where I think, in many ways, I think leadership has become so much more challenging now because of some of the things that we now have to navigate.
But at the same time, man, I think what's exciting to me about this is what you're really doing is giving your valued colleagues control to collaborate and to work on things that the CEO or his management team is saying, hey, I'm working on this. This is the objective. How can you help us get here? I used to have a client many, many years ago that was in the private equity industry, and he talked about people having personal equity in certain projects. And so I think that notion of what we're really doing is people giving a sense of control, collaboration, and some measure of personal equity into building something. And I actually think that's how you build a stronger employee base. That's exciting to me.
Yeah, that's great, Troy. So let's fast forward 5 years.
Yeah.
You and I are sitting down and we are talking about the Trust Barometer findings for 2028. Do you think there's more or less trust in organizations 5 years from now? Why not?
I don't know, because this is changing year over year. I believe that our best days are ahead of us, but I have watched kind of what's going on in the world today. And so the answer has been, I don't know, but my gut level is I think it's going to be, we'll have these issues resolved and we will have addressed some of the economic disparity, and hopefully our people people will feel some source of economic optimism. That's my hope. Do I know that? No. There's things, Ben, that I know, and there's things that I believe. That's what I hope, and that's what I believe.
That's great. And I think that's a lovely, sobering but optimistic viewpoint of the future. I mean, I think you're right, Troy. I think that's the best that we can expect in the environment that we kind of find ourselves in. And I think both business leaders and a number of people that I know will be watching this podcast, I think, recognize that there is no binary answer to this question.
That's right.
There are things that we can do that help shape and decisions that we can take today that will ultimately shape the future. And I think technology companies in particular played an incredibly important role in terms of being able to not only shape the technology industry, but a whole bunch of technology adjacent industries and industries that rely completely on digital technology today. So, Troy, I wanted to thank you again for the time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm actually kind of excited to maybe go back and do a round two, because there's a ton of stuff that I know we could go and unpack again as part of this year's Trust Barometer. But I wanted to thank you again for making the time and really appreciate partnering with you on this.
Ben, thank you so much for the invite. And this is a labor of love. It's been fun to be involved, and I'm fascinated by these findings. And I, too, am very, very interested to see where this goes. So thank you, and we'll look forward to chatting in a year.
Awesome. And thanks, folks, for those that are tuning in. This is the first of a number of sessions we'll be doing as part of the Nintex leadership series. We're excited to share more and started to bring a number of business leaders who can provide a really, really unique perspective of not only what's going on within the technology industry, but far beyond. So thank you so much. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.